Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Micah. You guys are rocking with me on Micah's Intellectual Corner. On today's episode, we're going to do our continuation of our Operation Barbarossa series. This is part 2, the invasion. Without further ado, let's just go and get started.
Welcome back to Weltkrieg News, reporting from the front. All three German army groups are moving ahead at a fairly comfortable pace, and by our accounts, the Red Army should be destroyed any time now. For more information, we go live to Army Group North.
There's no time to lose. We must find the colonnade. You mean there's more of them?
This was probably just a scout.
Well, I'm sure it's an isolated incident. Let's check in with Army Group South.
They're everywhere!
Well, surely it'll all be in hand soon.
Yeah, I remember in his last video that he was poking a lot of holes through the operation, especially by the end of the video. So obviously this is him on the take on that. But let's go ahead and get back into it.
Surely it'll all be in hand soon. For more, we go to our man on the ground, Heinrich, who is currently marching with the infantry to catch up and hopefully end the last of their resistance. Apparently he's in hospital from exhaustion. Well, keep your dial here on Weltkrieg News, covering the war for as long as it takes. Hopefully not much longer.
Well, and he's talking about, I feel like he's talking more on the end of the war than the beginning of it, because obviously in the beginning the Germans were, thinking that they were over cocky, overconfident almost, and thinking that they were going to be good on this. But I think that's what he's more talking about, not the or he's talking about more of the end, not the beginning.
Hopefully not much longer. This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Take back your internet privacy today with 3 free months by clicking the link in the description box below. This video is part 2 to the one a couple weeks ago about the planning of Operation Barbarossa. And if you haven't seen that one yet, I would recommend watching it first so that you can have some backstory to this one. I go into the planning and the reasons concerning why the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and it'll help contextualize this video.
Yeah, to caveat on what he said, I'll actually put a link into my, or a little thing, I'll put a little card up in the corner to link to my part 1 as well, of me reacting to his part 1, I guess. Yeah, let's go and get back into it.
Why the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and it'll help contextualize this video.
I thought it was dumb. Maybe you're right.
On June 22nd, 1941, the German army, along with its allies, invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. I'll be going over a few myths along with covering the main reasons that the operation failed, but the first myth that I want to mention, as petty as it may be, is that Hitler did not invade the USSR in the winter. The invasion began in June as early as it could after the spring rains, but I still see these "don't attack Russia in the winter" memes everywhere, and it's just not true.
What are you, retarded?
You may have a point as far as continuing the invasion once the winter sets in, but the invasion did not take place in the winter. Even Hitler wasn't stupid enough to do that.
Yeah, and I already knew that too. I just know, because obviously he did start in June, but I'm pretty sure that he wasn't thinking on continuing it into the winter. That's why he didn't give his troops any winter gear, or a lot of winter gear anyway, if I'm not mistaken. So he just thought that for some reason it would take 4 to 5 months for them to get from Poland essentially to Moscow, which is kind of crazy to think about. But
winter. Even Hitler wasn't stupid enough to do that. So
Stop it!
The invading forces were split into 3 army groups: North, Center, and South. Their basic objectives being Leningrad, Moscow, and the Ukraine respectively. Within these army groups, though, you basically have 2 separate armies. The panzer troops, who are mechanized and consist of about 30 divisions altogether, and the infantry, who number about 110 divisions. The common narrative...
That makes sense, because I think that's about 140 divisions altogether. There's about 10,000 to 15,000 soldiers in each division. I think that equals up to about 3 million, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not that great at math, but it makes sense.
Narrative of the invasion is of the German army being this huge mechanized force, performing encirclements all around the Red Army, killing and capturing scores of men all the way until they were lightly halted in front of Moscow.
Everything's under control, situation normal.
And to a certain extent, this is true. Soviet casualties compared to German casualties, especially once you factor in the ones lost to the encirclements, are much higher. But as Stayhill points out, you have to look at where these casualties are concentrated. The infantry during Barbarossa was only moving as fast as someone can walk, moving at literally the same pace Napoleon's army moved when they invaded Russia years prior.
See, I guess I never really thought of that either, but it does make sense that they probably wouldn't have enough vehicle transports for 3 million freaking troops, and even if they did, once that mud starts setting in, you know what I'm saying, and that dust starts setting in, it's too much, you know?
Russia years prior, meaning that they're going to have trouble keeping up with the mechanized forces. And this is an issue that I don't see talked about much, but is vital to understanding later problems. Because this means that the panzer divisions are the ones meeting the enemy first and taking the brunt of what the Soviet defending forces are throwing at the German army. So although German casualties look pretty light compared to the Soviets, they aren't being equally distributed amongst the army.
Can you help me out? Sorry, I got my own problems, guys.
The panzer troops are being hit hard and are the ones taking the losses, meaning the strength of these vital troops is waning pretty fast, taking a lot of the hitting power out of the German army for these.
Yeah, especially whenever you think about it, when these the panzer division and all that, or the tank divisions are the main thing that you need for a blitzkrieg to actually work, you know what I'm saying? So without that, you essentially don't have it. Because you can't do it with just infantry alone, you know?
The German army for these huge encirclements. This also leads to a problem of the tanks outrunning the infantry, causing dangerous gaps between the two forces that the encircled enemy may still be operating in. This got so bad that between the battles of Minsk and Smolensk, Army Group Center's war diary mentions a halt period for the infantry to catch up as the distance between the two was getting too great, something that, as you can probably imagine, did not fit well with blitzkrieg. Material was being lost at greater rates than the Germans were used to as well. The panzer groups were losing a lot of tanks not from battle, but simply from attrition. The dusty terrain of the Soviet Union proved to be a fairly poor place for the German tank.
And I can already imagine, because just thinking about it, these vehicles are probably just hard enough to keep, you know, maintenance up on it on just a normal, terrain, normal conditions, even probably peacetime. So think about throwing them into non-stop go on top of dust and all. Yeah, it's just, there was nothing going. So
Really poor place for the German tanks, created with Western Europe in mind, to operate. Huge amounts of dust caused by the moving tank columns driving through the dirt roads of the Soviet Union would get sucked into the engines of the vehicles, causing a high attrition rate for the panzer formations. For example, in August, Panzer Groups 2 and 3 claimed losses of 50% of their tanks, most of which were perfectly capable and still usable vehicles. They just needed new engines, because the terrain and dust had locked them up. Guderian on multiple occasions went to the commander of Army Group Center asking for more engines. Because the tanks were there, they just couldn't run. But this was an unforeseen issue, as the Germans always fought short campaigns in the past, and planned for this one to be the same, as I mentioned in part 1. So spare engines were never created in the numbers that were needed, because the campaign typically was over before these problems arose. But if the engines were
and it's like you couple that with their lack of oil for the say trucks and tanks that need it, you know what I'm saying? It's not, you can see the cracks starting to unfold essentially, you know what I'm saying?
These problems arose. But if the engines were available, this may not have been a fix to the problem, because also, as I mentioned in part 1, the supply problems that were predicted very quickly became reality. As the Germans move into the Soviet Union, they naturally move further and further away from their supply dumps at the jumping off point, meaning that the further they went, the longer it took for supplies to be brought up, and the things that were bringing supplies, namely trucks, were consuming more supplies themselves to get.
And see, and that has to make you think, like, did they leave their main supply points at the back in East Prussia or the Polish area? Did they leave their main supply there, or steadily as their front line started moving up, did they at least try to move that slowly up with it? By the sound of it, they didn't. But if they did, let me know, guys.
More supplies themselves to get there. And this process got more and more difficult as the campaign went on. Supply groups were also being hindered by the large gap between the tanks and the infantry mentioned earlier, and that when going through these areas, there were oftentimes Soviet forces that would remain active that would be able to attack the trucks, along with many of them also being lost to attrition in the same way the tanks were, from the very rough and dusty terrain of the Soviet Union. By August, Army Group Center reportedly lost about 25% of their trucks, and Army Group North had lost 39%. The other way supplies were brought up was by train. This, however, had a lot of complications to it. Firstly, Soviet trains were bigger. The Soviet Union was a larger country, so larger trains were needed to cover the distances compared to those in Western Europe, and this meant that the gauge of the rail line was greater and German trains could not run on them.
It's crazy that they have to, like, they didn't think about half the stuff that's coming up. So in the middle of a very important, and all these different important battles and stuff, they're having to come up with different ways to, get what they need, and they don't have that type of time. They don't have that type of they don't have those type of resources. They don't have those type of time. That type of time. So it's just is doomed from the start, is what it sounded like.
And German trains could not run on them. The Germans did have a couple of solutions to this. That included units moving along the rail lines that would shorten the gauges for the trains as they went along. But because German trains couldn't run for as long, it meant that they would need to create more service stations along the route to keep them running. In essence, a large-scale building project had to accompany this invasion if the trains were going to be used in the ways that they wanted to. This was often easier said than done, though, as the Soviets enacted a scorched earth policy as they retreated, destroying railways, train stations, and locomotives alike to keep them falling into German hands. And although there were units instructed to move along the rail lines to prevent this from happening as much as they could, some units disobeyed these orders, and a lot of the infrastructure fell victim to retreating Soviets, to where the trucks had to remain the primary method of moving supplies throughout the campaign. And this issue really comes to a head during Operation Typhoon that will...
It just feels like even if the logistics officers would have spoken up, they probably just got yelled at and probably threatened with their lives, you know what I'm saying, if they would have spoken up about it. So it wouldn't have mattered anyway, because Hitler was just so dead set on this.
And this issue really comes to a head during Operation Typhoon that we'll get to later in the series. The overall result of these supply problems ends up being exactly what the German logistics officers had predicted. A start-stop pattern over and over again for German units as they move forward. Run out of supplies, then wait for more to be brought up so they can continue again, all the way into the rainy season in the late fall. Even through all these odds, though, the Germans were able to win a number of huge victories in the opening months of the campaign. First taking Minsk and then Smolensk, and besieging Leningrad, utterly devastating the first Soviet defensive echelon. Many hundreds of thousands of troops are taken prisoner, and for the moment to the Germans, and the world, it looks like the Soviet Union might fall, with some German newspapers in early October proclaiming victory in the East. However, German intelligence...
It's just they miscalculated their opposition. That's what I'm going to say that they did. They miscalculated the opposition, and now we see what is, what happened in history. We know what happened. You know what I'm saying? They got taken over and they were defeated. So.
In the East. However, German intelligence has completely failed at their analysis of the Red Army, how many troops, and how much material they could truly muster.
Yeah, they failed miserably because of the fact that, like, how do you, on top of the miss, and obviously Russia, or the USSR was a closed country, but at the same time it was once an open country. So how do you miss population? The fact that the scorched earth tactics that they saw in Napoleon's time, and just the fact that the lack of road, you know what I'm saying, they didn't even look at that and think to themselves we have to do something to prevent something. But it's I don't know, I feel like it's just because Hitler was he was so dead set on this. It's just nothing that nobody could tell him.
Truly muster. By the Germans' count, they should have destroyed the Red Army by this point. By their rather accurate assessment of it consisting of about 5.5 million men. What they had failed to realize, though, was the Soviet Union's capacity to call up and muster the trained reservists it had. And the German commanders are completely vexed by this.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it!
After the initial invasion in June 22nd, the Red Army was able to raise an additional 5.3 million men by the end of July. And later on, although I'm getting ahead of myself, by December, the Red Army would number about 8 million men on the Eastern Front, in spite of their heavy losses.
Yeah, it's kind of foolish to think that somebody like Stalin would not be one to call up essentially everyone in that country to come and fight on the front line. You know what I'm saying? somebody like Stalin, yeah, everybody's gonna have to come up and fight.
On the Eastern Front, in spite of their heavy losses, according to author David Glantz. Although the Germans have been fairly successful by the looks of things so far, by October, in the beginnings of Operation Typhoon and the approach to Moscow, the cracks are really beginning to show. They're already a month past when the campaign was supposed to be decided in September. Soviet armies continue appearing in front of them, even though by their count they should have destroyed it almost a few times over by now. Divisions are quickly becoming under strength, supplies are having more and more trouble getting to where they need to be, and yet the objective is still the same. Capitulate the Soviet Union, and forces are being driven ahead time and time again, without proper replacements and with exhaustion growing. The successes have been great, but there seems to be a growing dissonance between the command.
Well, I mean, and I feel like there's a lot of people in Hitler's ear trying to get him to understand, like, hey, certain things need to happen in order for this to be successful, but he wasn't listening to any of it. He just wanted it done. But he didn't want it done right, so...
But there seems to be a growing dissonance between the commanders making the calls and the troops on the ground. And despite the obvious problems that are surfacing, the grand strategy, or really lack of it, has not changed. Although some objectives are being tweaked as time goes on. And as the rainy season sets in, Army Group Center sets itself up for what they hope to be the last push that will land them in Red Square.
Alright guys, with that, we'll go ahead and call it, we'll go ahead and end it right there. So yeah, part 2 of Operation Barbarossa. I would have to say, I don't know, it's just, you can, I guess with potential history doing his thing, I guess you can start seeing a lot of the holes starting to poke through. And I think a really big one is just that, those logistics on top of lack of planning. It's horrible, but anyway, with that being said, thank you guys again for joining me on another episode of Mike's Intellectual Corner. I'll see you guys out. I'm out. Peace.